at the end of the interview, I'll say like, okay, well, thanks for joining us. Have a good night. And then you'll say, okay, this was terrible and I'll never do it again. Bye. And and then that'll be like
I'm sure I won't say that.
and then that'll be like our fake ending. And I'm not gonna like hang up on you as soon as that happens. We can go ahead. Right. We can do a little debrief at the end if there's a little bit more to talk about. But that'll be our ending for the purposes of the recording. So just so you kind of know what's going on there.
Thank you.
All right.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. You're listening to episode 320. Our theme this week is keeping cool on climate. I am your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science from across the pond. Not yet cut off from all humanity because we still got Skype. It's Patrick Wheatley.
So actually, I've kind of forgotten how to use this thing. Is this thing on?
It's on. It's on. You're here. You're here with me. It's been too long.
It's been a long time.
Yeah,
that is for sure.
Time zones make things tough, but now that we're all working from home, I can kind of shift my day around a little bit, and we can.
Yeah. The sun is setting here at the prime meridian.
It is still high in the sky here in DC. We've been having an absolutely lovely spring in which I have very little desire to go outside and do anything.
Yeah, we had the same. The 3 weeks of good weather that England has every year have decided to come right now while we're in lockdown.
I mean, it feels too obvious to realize that this is also highly correlated with nobody driving their cars around and mucking things up atmospherically, right?
Yeah, that's actually depressing me.
You've been on a real anti-car kick for people who follow you on Twitter.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've gotten fired up.
Your Twitter feed is all just about like walking around and closing roads.
Yeah, well, I feel like since I finally lived in a place where you actually could get around, I feel like in the U.S. we built everything to the point where the car is basically a necessity. There's like 5 places you could live in the U.S. where you wouldn't absolutely have to own a car, and I just think that's
New York City,
ridiculous.
And some others.
Chicago, maybe.
I'm all about your new passion. I've enjoyed all the tweets, and it has made me think a lot about the way we move people around. I've also been heartened by the increase in electric bikes that I'm seeing around. I know that there's been some issues with like electric mountain bikes in like national parks and on public lands, but as far as a way to get people around a city, I think they work pretty well. DC's got a few hills. It's not crazy, but like you can still get most anywhere you want to go in DC without breaking a crazy sweat using one of those electric bikes.
I'm not much of a biker, really. So I think anything you can do to get, I know that bikers a lot of times have mixed emotions about e-bikes, and that cities too seem to have mixed emotions about e-bikes for some reason. Especially, I know New York is hard on them in terms of deliveries, it's like food deliveries. They don't like people using e-bikes for some reason. But anything you can do to get somebody out of a car is a good thing.
Yeah, what I often say is like anything you can do to get people around the city without burning carbon.
But I think it's more. I think it's even more than that. I think that cars. I mean, you can follow my Twitter feed for more on this opinion, but I think cars just take up a lot of space and screw up your city in ways that even if they were electric, they would still be a problem.
Oh yeah. I see. I totally see that point.
The space it takes to park a car, how hard it is to cross the streets in North America because we've got these multiple wide lanes, because we've decided that the car is the most important thing in the city, and we relegate, pedestrians and bikes to the very edges, and you take your life in your hands if you need to venture across the asphalt for any reason.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, man. I'm all about it. I mean, I'm excited about driverless cars, but that's a different issue that I think will help solve some of those problems of the safety aspect of things. But what's DC before everything kind of shut down has, and it still has them. I just haven't been using them. Has these electric mopeds. Mm-hmm. They're a lot of fun. Like you can't, they're limited in what they can do. You can't like take them on the interstate or anything, but like you can get up to 30 on them and cruise around town on this little electric moped. It's pretty nice.
I don't really have a problem. I mean, I know we fight over like the like bird or lime scooters or whatever, and people using them on the sidewalks. And I just think no, we're so blinded to the fact that we've given all the space to the cars that we just fight amongst each other over
On
the little
sidewalk.
piece of land we have left. Yeah. And nobody even thinks like, wait a minute, why are we get rid of the big hunking pieces of metal that only have a person right in the middle?
Yeah, I'm with you, man.
Yeah. All right. Anyway,
no, I've been enjoying watching your evolution into a radical reformer of our cities and roads. It's good. It's good stuff. Quality follow if people are looking for that.
my issue is more the way we build like our development plan in North America. So the car is just, it's not that I actually hate cars that much. It's just that we build all of our infrastructure to support the car. So if we would just, I think a car is fine if you want to go from one place to another, but driving around the place once you get there in the car, I think is a mess. Anyway, let's have a real episode here.
I mean, I think, that was sort of science, right? City planning and infrastructure. And yeah. So I have an interview that I did with a Ph.D. student, Maya Becker, and I'll introduce her in the context of the interview, but we're going to be talking about the work that she's done, advocacy work, in terms of talking about the seriousness of global climate change and how it's going to affect people. So it is a good lead in that sense. And some of the research she does in Antarctica. And I think I'm going to play the first half of the interview now, and then Patrick and I will pop in for a quick drinks segment about midway through, and then we'll be back at the end for our little feedback segment.
All right, cool. I'm excited to hear from Maya.
Here we go. I'm being joined by Maya Becker, who is a PhD candidate in the Fricker Group at the Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which is at the University of California, San Diego. I was pitched you as an interviewee by my old friend Lauren Wood, who does some strategic communications for Scripps, and she sent me like half a dozen different links for things that you and I could talk about. So I'm really excited to start working through some of these topics with you. So thanks for being here, Maya.
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm super excited to do this. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So normally we'll talk about a person's science and then talk about maybe some of their more outreach activities, but we can flip it if we want to talk about the op-ed you wrote for the San Diego Union Tribune.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. I'm down to go down that road.
Okay, cool. So you wrote it's labeled as a commentary op-ed. I don't know if there's a terminological distinction there, but it's titled "Why Ocean Lovers Should Follow Global Climate Conference." And this is the COP25 conference that happened in December. We're recording this in January, where a bunch of countries, but notably not the US, I believe, went and met to come up with no resolution on what to do about climate. Do you want to introduce the concept better than I just did, or tell people what the deal was?
That was a great introduction, but sure. So actually the US is still participating in those sorts of international climate negotiations. They just sent a smaller team, to my understanding, than they have in the past, and a younger team. So they've kind of pulled out their maybe big shot negotiators and sent maybe lower level negotiators or scientists in the policy realm to actually represent U.S. interests. But basically, this is the big international climate negotiation that led to the Paris Agreement, and the Trump administration indicated that it is formally starting the process to withdraw. And so the rest of the world is still meeting and actively trying to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And they meet once a year in this thing called the Conference of the Parties. And so that's what I attended in Madrid in December.
Oh, so you actually went to this?
Yes, I did. And I went to COP24 in Katowice, Poland, the previous year in 2018. And Scripps is really great at kind of advocating for their PhD students and postdocs to explore the realm of science policy. And Scripps sends probably 20 or so PhD students, master's students, and postdocs to COPs every year to kind of represent Scripps' interests and tell negotiators what Scripps oceanography science is telling us about the effects of climate change on our oceans and things like the ice sheets, to kind of just lend more science to an otherwise pretty policy and more fuzzy feeling conference.
Okay, cool. And what was the experience like? I mean, I've never been to anything like that. I can't. Is it I mean, in comparison to like a giant conference like AGU, like is it bigger, smaller, more intimate, more people dress up better? Like what you know, what's the feeling on the ground?
Well, no offense to scientists, but yes, people do dress up better at COP.
Scientists
than
can
at
be a
AGU.
little sartorially challenged.
Yeah. I mean, definitely with their own sense of flair, but I definitely saw some snazzier outfits at COP than at AGU. So in terms of size, they're about the same. I think there were 25,000 people at COP, which is on par with AGU. I might have gotten that number wrong, but it's
big.
kind of, it's big and it's similarly overwhelming. There aren't things like poster halls or anything like that, but there is an exhibit hall, and that's where Scripps usually sits on the day-to-day. And then there are also smaller breakout rooms where things called side events are going on, and that's where experts and other panelists kind of come together to discuss a particular issue. There are press conferences about science or about new programs to tackle specific agenda items. And then there's an entirely different section of the COP, which is the negotiation hall, I guess you could say. And that's where all of the country delegates and in a lot of cases, pretty prominent heads of state will kind of congregate. And that's where all of the negotiations on specific aspects of the Paris Agreement text or implementation or texts related to the implementation of the Paris Agreement kind of take place.
What's the feeling when you're there? Like, is it serious affair, or does it feel more like a typical conference where everyone's kind of hanging out and having a good time, the sort of summer camp vibes of seeing old friends,
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. So the negotiation side is fairly serious.
Do you get to go over to the negotiation side, or is that kind of sequestered?
It is sequestered. But it's usually just like a fact of physical distance. So you just have to kind of haul your butt over to the negotiation side. But most of the negotiations in the first week, which is the week that I went, this is a 2-week conference, I should say, most of them are open, and the bodies that are actually presiding over this meeting, this conference, decides kind of at various points throughout the 2 weeks whether they want to keep negotiations on specific items open to observers. And Scripps is an observer organization, so whenever it's open to observers, we can go. But yeah, in the more observer heavy part of COP, I'd say the tone is a little less formal. People are having pretty intense meetings or putting on pretty intense events, but then there are also, a lot of countries have things called pavilions, which is basically where they're event spaces where they kind of showcase all of their climate or green initiatives. And they also have things like coffee bars, and 5 p.m. or even earlier, they all start to serve wine or beer. And so there is kind of this jovial atmosphere in part of the COP, but in the negotiation side, I think it's pretty down to business. And there's also a lot of or at least in Madrid, there was a fair amount of protesting going on. And Greta Thunberg was there for a little bit of it, or at least a week maybe. And so she kind of MO, I guess you could say, was that politicians aren't taking the climate crisis seriously enough. The part of COP that was focused on her was a bit more serious and also a bit more press focused. So that kind of changed the mood a little bit too.
Well, it seems like you were able to get some politicians' attention, because it sounds like Nancy Pelosi and some other congressional folks from California came by, the Cryosphere Pavilion.
Oh, yeah. Nancy Pelosi, and then Mike Levin and Scott Peters. So Mr. Levin and Mr. Peters are actually representatives in the San Diego area, and are some of our representatives, or some of the Scripps delegates' representatives. And so they came by twice. And then the second time they came by the Scripps booth, they actually brought several other members of the congressional delegation that came to sort of indicate, like, even though Trump wants to pull out of the Paris Agreement, we're still in it. Several of the members of that delegation, including Nancy Pelosi, came by our booth. And it was just the most incredible moment. And our Scripps' director, Margaret Linen, was there. And we had brought this buoy that can actually be sent down to the depths of the ocean, to I think 6,000 meters depth, to actually profile the ocean properties. And so we had brought one of those as kind of a prop for our booth. And our director, Margaret Leinen, spent about 2 or 3 minutes just talking about this buoy with Nancy Pelosi. And I was kind of fangirling in the corner because two of these incredibly powerful and inspiring women were talking to each other right in front of me. And it was just a really amazing moment and something that I'm really grateful to Scripps for.
That's awesome. And so upon coming home from that, you decided to, what inspired you to write about this in the newspaper? It's kind of an old-fashioned response, I feel like.
So two of the other Scripps graduate students who went to COP and I, Erica Ferrer and Julia Donor, we actually wrote the op-ed before we left for Madrid. And another of the masterful Scripps communications team, Rob Monroe, had kind of encouraged a few of us or anybody who was interested to consider writing an op-ed to kind of describe why this COP was really important for San Diegans and why Scripps really cared about this COP. Oh, and I should have said this before, but this COP, COP25, was actually called the Blue COP because it had a really increased emphasis on ocean issues compared to previous years. And so that made it a really important conference for Scripps to kind of represent its science at. And then it also just made it, so what we decided to talk about in the op-ed was how San Diegans and San Diego, which is a city kind of built on the ocean economy and relying on the ocean for everything from tourism to military to food, really needs to pay attention to, because this is the COP, this is the conference that's actually going to start to really consider ocean issues in a really meaningful way.
I've been to San Diego a number of times and never set foot on a beach.
Really? Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry to hear that.
I'm there as part of the nerd economy for Comic-Con. So,
oh, nice. Well, I haven't been to Comic-Con, so I guess we've each missed a critical aspect of San Diego.
So like the closest I ever get to the water is trying to get on any of the boat parties that are happening in the marina after the show. But I'm always so busy with Comic-Con stuff that I spend no time on the water. It's kind of sad now that I think about it.
Next time you come to San Diego for Comic-Con, you'll have to carve out a beach day.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, I also, a lot of times when I was going to Comic-Con, I was living in Santa Cruz. So I had a surplus of beaches in my life. I wasn't that hard up for a nice California beach.
Yeah, fair enough.
Water's still pretty cold even down in San Diego.
Oh my gosh. I'm from Miami originally, and the Pacific Ocean is not only terrifying, but it is way too cold for me.
Yeah, it's not a very pacifying ocean given its name.
No, definitely not. Good point.
So you wanted to point out why conferences like this are so important for San Diego and San Diegans, but what is the why? Like, why are they such a big deal?
So what the whole, I guess, point of our op-ed was, and this was kind of an interesting thing to try and navigate. I think while we were writing it, we were trying to figure out how political we should go, and whether we should just kind of keep it to the facts that like multiple, like San Diego's multi-billion-dollar economy is tied to the ocean. And so if at COP something gets decided that directly affects, say, like long-term planning for ocean observation and monitoring via satellites, for example, if that decision ends up meaning that we have maybe fewer, curtailed observations of San Diego's coastal ecosystems or sea level, for example, then that could end up down the line affecting San Diego's economy. And San Diego is it's built, I guess everybody here has a stake in the ocean, whether they know it or not, or whether they or whether they appreciate it or not. I mean, even now, this is going to sound incredibly spoiled, but I'm sitting in my office and I'm looking out over the ocean. And so every day I interact with the ocean, and it's not just because I'm an oceanographer or in an oceanography Ph.D. program. And I think most people in San Diego can say the same thing. And our way of life is really tied to the sustainability of our ocean resources. And so if any city in the country, and we're kind of in this interesting position because we have several science institutions that are focused on the ocean in San Diego. And we have the Navy, which is a huge user of ocean resources and also seeks to understand a lot about the ocean and basically.
For, I know we have a broad spectrum of listeners, and so not every listener is shares the political affiliation that one might expect from a group of scientists. But I will say that the Department of Defense takes climate change very seriously. They consider it a threat multiplier. They're doing a lot in places like San Diego and Norfolk, Virginia, to shore up their heavy investments in the infrastructure of maintaining a military presence there. And if you're on a boat and you need to dock somewhere and sea levels are rising, you can't not take that seriously just because you don't like the politics of the people who promote the work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And somebody in my group, or in my wider group at Scripps, he was in the Coast Guard before he decided to come do his master's here. I think the Coast Guard is actually funding his master's. And he is anticipating being placed at the National Ice Center, I think it's called. So he's going to be one of the people, or hopefully will be one of the people, who's actually monitoring the drift of sea ice and the drift of icebergs, which could affect the trajectories of naval vessels and international vessels around the world, at least in the polar regions. And so, studying the ocean and studying ice in the polar regions and climate more generally is really important too.
Yeah, I went to a talk not long ago enough that I don't remember all the details to give you a good explanation of what I'm about to say, but recently enough that I kind of remember it. There's this weird thing, and you might understand the science of this better, and if so, just cut me off and explain it. But there's this weird thing that, if the ice sheets on Greenland are melting, sea level doesn't necessarily go up around Greenland. It actually goes up in other places around the world, and has to do with the thermodynamics of cold water versus warm water versus these weird displacement wedges that occur, and imperfect mixing of the ocean. But essentially you can't, it's not just towns in Greenland that need to be worried about the ice sheets melting. If anything, those towns are actually safer for longer because there's a weird dynamic that happens where the sea level doesn't go up locally until the very end of the melt.
Yeah. I don't know if this is, so I don't know much about the ocean dynamics and the effects on mixing and wedges and stuff like that. But I do know, and I was just at a seminar about this morning, actually. So what's really interesting about these massive ice sheets is that they actually exert a gravitational pull.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
On the ocean around them. And so that kind of, when the ice sheet is at its maximal extent, it kind of sucks up all of this ocean water. And then as it starts to melt and lose mass, the water kind of flows away.
And then the ice is heavy enough that Greenland itself is going to bounce back up from being let off. So Greenland is going to go up, and the ocean isn't necessarily going to go up as well. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And that means that
San Diego's not going up.
Right. And so what's really interesting to me, and kind of how I contextualize a lot of what I study, is that places like San Diego and the U.S. coasts are going to actually be affected above the average amount by melting ice from Antarctica, which is kind of crazy, but it's because of this gravitational effect. So because the U.S. coasts are in what we call the far field of Antarctica, that actually means that our coasts are going to receive more than the global average of sea level rise.
But I think that's very counterintuitive to a lot of people, and so I think once you explain it, I think the logic of it makes sense. But you have to walk people baby step. You had to walk me through it baby steps when I saw this. When I saw this lecture, and then just now because I'd forgotten about that pesky little thing called gravity. So,
it does rear its head quite annoyingly, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then there's the whole thing about being close to the equator. Water tends to bulge out because the Earth is spinning. Warm water takes up more space. So it's there's a lot of factors at play that are going to make it harder for places that we think of as traditionally hotter.
Exactly.
So one thing I'm really curious about is what was the response? How did people in the community, in the San Diego community, respond to this op-ed?
So I told myself that I wasn't going to read the comments, but of course I did. And when I went and read the comments, there was only one of them, and it was very positive. But I got a few emails from Scripps professors or affiliates saying, thank you for writing this. It's really important not only to Scripps that San Diego understands the importance of this COP, but it's important to them as well. And you guys did a really great job of kind of selling this and selling the idea of people following these climate negotiations more rigorously, or period. And so we didn't get a ton of feedback from the local community, but I'm hoping that it was positive. I don't know if anybody actually ended up following COP, but the good news is that the San Diego Union Tribune is starting to publish more climate-related material. And I think there was a few weeks later, there was another piece published on the University of California's climate action goals. And so we like to think that we're kind of getting the ball rolling on sort of scientist-driven op-eds. And
hoping for a sort of snowball effect?
Yeah, maybe. That would be great.
That was dumb.
No.
So is this a method of outreach that you would encourage other scientists to consider, even if they're maybe not even climate scientists, but just as members of their community?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, I feel like I'm coming from a pretty privileged position. I have we had the backing of a big communications team, and Scripps' name means a lot in San Diego already. But I think that, or if your passion is writing, then an op-ed is a really great medium for kind of expressing whatever it is about climate change or your science that you feel like people should know about and pay attention to. I don't know, maybe another forum would make more sense for other people, but for me, writing has always kind of made more sense than speaking, although I am on this podcast, so we'll see. And I think it's a nice way to kind of get your message out there without having to put yourself out there physically as much. Like, yes, you can still be looked up and things like that, but I think it's a really great way to reach a readership and reach people.
And does Scripps have people in place who are able to put you in touch with the right editor at the Tribune, or like how did that kind of?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So Rob Monroe, the communications guy, who encouraged us to write the op-ed in the first place, pitched it for us, which was really helpful because I wouldn't know the first thing about pitching an op-ed.
Right. And I would guess if we have any, scientist listeners who are interested in something like this and work for a larger institution, I'm almost positive that most universities and large research institutions would have a media person whose job it is to, make these sort of connections. So if you're not sure where to start or intimidated, I bet there's a resource already available to you if you go track it down and find it.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, I think it's really amazing that you wrote this thing. I think it's a thing that scientists should be considering doing more often, just because politics aside, all politics is still local. And so the fact that you put this out there for your community that you live in, I think is really impressive. But I also imagine it's probably a little stressful to hit the send key.
Yeah, it was. And we're 3 female Ph.D. students. And so I'm sure there are people in certain factions of San Diego that would think why should I listen to these 3 20-something-year-old women? Yeah, they're scientists, but they don't have real life experience, or they don't understand the economy, or they don't know this or that. And it's scary to put yourself out there, but I think we have a real obligation when we know something about climate change and when we know something about our planet. And if we don't do anything to share it, then I think we're kind of letting our discipline down and letting our planet down.
Well, and a thought that I often have is, there are a lot of situations in life where you can't help. If you are a privileged person, you didn't ask for the privilege. It was just, it's inherent to wherever you find yourself at that moment in your life. And so if you can't help having the privilege, then you might as well do something with it.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I imagine after you hit the send key, you probably were interested in having a drink. So I will go ahead and use that as my subtle transition. Use that as my subtle transition to ask you while we sit here and record this podcast. I can't see you, so I know you're looking at the ocean. You've got a great view. What are you pairing with your view?
Ooh, well, I am not a huge alcohol drinker, but I love coffee. I think I speak for most Ph.D. students and scientists generally when I say that I literally run on coffee. And one place that I really love visiting, kind of after a long week of work, is this place called WestBean Coffee Roasters. It's in Bankers Hill in San Diego, so just west of Balboa Park. And my partner is also a PhD student, and so we bike there on the weekends, and if we need to get some work done, we'll just hang out there, or we'll just catch up and debrief over some really delicious coffee.
Are you a single origin, a blend person? What's your roast profile?
So
what's your preferred brewing method?
So I'm actually I'm not very picky when it comes to coffee. I love all. Yeah, exactly. There was this terrible coffee shop near my college, and I think it's closed now, so I think I can say this, but the coffee was literally like dishwasher liquid, and it was just so disgusting. But I was like, well, even though it tastes bad, the taste certainly wakes me up, so it's effective. And so I just kept on going there and getting more coffee. And everybody around me was like, Maya, why are you doing this? This coffee stinks. And I was like, well, I'm awake, so what do you want from me?
There's a coffee roaster here in DC that I can't tell if they have good coffee or not, because I find their name so off-putting that I can't drink the coffee without thinking about the name.
Oh, no. Oh.
They're the Lost Sock Coffee Roasting Company. And apologies to Lost Sock, but like that's, they're referring to the historical, like the cowboy thing of brewing coffee in a sock. And
I didn't know about that. Ugh.
Yeah, it's like a thing cowboys do. You put you take your sock off, put the grinds in a sock, and then throw it, soak it in some hot water. And it's that's such a gross idea to me that's where the sock, like that's why you've lost your sock, is because you're using it to make the coffee. That I can't, like every time I sip the coffee, I'm like, I just can't tell if it's good coffee or not.
Oh yeah, I totally get that. I would think that name would work if it were like some sort of laundromat coffee shop hybrid or something.
Yeah, that would be cute. I'd be like, oh.
Yeah, exactly. Go find all your
when they're at the like local farmer's market or whatever, I'm just like, I'll get a cup of coffee because I need something while I'm walking around this farmer's market. But like, I'm not happy about it.
No. That's hilarious.
Well, as people who've listened to the show know, I am a bit more of a beer drinker, and I'm a few hours ahead of you as well. So it's not inappropriate for me to pull something out, because I'm here on East. Because San Diego to DC, and one of the people who are regular listeners will be familiar with, Abe, and I found out about this place in Maryland called the Brookeville Beer Farm, and I was like, I want to go to a beer farm. Like, we go to breweries all the time, but a beer farm sounds like delightful. And so we took one of these alarmingly warm winter weekend days we've been having here in DC, and I told Abe, like, I found the brewery, you find the hiking trail. So he found us a nature area to go hike around, and then afterwards we went and checked out this beer farm. And it actually is a working farm, and they grow a bunch of the ingredients for the beer on the farm. Awesome. And then they like give the spent grain to, other farms that have like animals, and they use some of the spent grain for making like dough for pizza and stuff. So it was really cool. It was a really fun spot. Very picturesque. Awesome. It was reminiscent to me of like some of the more farming-esque style like wineries in the Virginia like Shenandoah area, but this was focused on beer and in Maryland. And so I got a mixed pack, and I picked one that is called the Barred Owl. They have a bunch of different like bird owl themed beers, but I thought like Barred Owl, the label is on like a nice snowy wintry background, and I thought like, I'm talking to a person who thinks a lot about ice. I'll go ahead and have like a frosty frigid beer. It's a white IPA, which is not a style I've ever really enjoyed, but we'll see if maybe this is the one that breaks the mold.
Wait, what is a white IPA? I'm a terrible San Diegan for asking this question, because everybody here knows everything there is to know about IPAs, but that is.
I think it's an IPA, like an American style IPA, but with wheat in it to make it more like a wit beer.
Okay.
But yeah, it's not a style that I've been overly fond of in the past. But I think it's sort of like if a Blue Moon had a bunch of hops shoved down its throat.
Okay, gotcha. That's a great description.
So, but this one says that it's a white IPA brewed with fresh grapefruit, hopped with Mosaic and Amarillo hops. And I do really like IPAs with grapefruit. I think
Yes.
the grapefruit and the hops is a nice pairing. So I
Yes.
was willing to give this one a try, and it is not bad. And I don't know, the label's so pretty. I know owls to me are like they exist on that uncanny valley of they're either like the most majestic, serene looking thing, or they're utterly terrifying and alien.
Yeah. That's awesome.
And so if I wanted to escape the terror of the owls and trade them for a larger but maybe less threatening bird like the penguin, I might head down to Antarctica, and
might.
I might see some of your research happening.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't do anything with penguins, and I've never seen one. But
You've never seen? I mean, you've got a zoo nearby that's has some renown. They probably got a penguin or two roaming around. You could go check out.
True. Yeah, I actually haven't been to the zoo yet, so on my bucket list.
It is a world-class zoo. You got it.
Yeah.
So I know I did a drinks segment with Maya, but it's been a while since Patrick was on the show, so I thought, why not break up the interview with another quick drink segment, because it would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't talk about what we were drinking. Patrick, I believe you tried an experiment.
I have an experiment, yeah. So super excited about, all the, in quarantine social media, it's been all about the fermentation, right? There's been lots of like sourdough bros posting all their wares. So I don't know how I wound up down this rabbit hole, but I got down a rabbit hole of fermenting things, and I wound up with reading about ginger bug, which is just fermented ginger that you can use to make ginger beer, or you can add it to other sort of juices or sweet drinks to make a.
Is ginger bug like a starter, but a sourdough starter, but made with ginger? Right.
So it's basically a sourdough. Exactly. It's a sourdough starter, but you're making it with just like grated ginger and some water.
Oh,
so
really?
Like cup and a half of water. What? Well, I can't even say water anymore. Water is how I'd say it. I have to say water here, or no one understands what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah. So you want like a cup and a half of that sitting in a mason jar or something. Each day you'd put like a tablespoon of grated ginger and a tablespoon of sugar into it and stir it up. You do that for about 5 days or maybe a week, and you should see the CO2 being made, and some of your ginger is going to float to the top, and that's how you should know that things are active in there. And is
the bacteria just ambient, or you're not introducing like a yeast or anything, right?
No, I didn't. So, well, we'll see how this experiment goes, but I didn't. The directions I read, so I was reading from the I think it was this Zero Waste Chef or Zero Waste Kitchen, something like that. That was the blog that I read. And no, they seem to think as long as you don't have like, if you've got chlorinated water, you should let it sit for a while.
Well, the way you switch into the accent, you sound like Simon Pegg, Unkar Plot giving Ray her portions. 1/4 portion.
Right. 1 cup of water. Where were we?
You were talking about where the bacteria, the source of
Right.
your fermenting microbes.
So yeah, you may have trouble if you have irradiated ginger for whatever reason. So they recommended organic ginger just because it wouldn't have been treated with something antimicrobial, most likely. And if you've got chlorinated water, you have. I'll never be able to speak again when I get back. You have to let that sort of sit for a day or two to sort of let the chlorine sort of evolve off of it. But I didn't have either one of those issues. I apparently didn't have either one of those issues when I was making the ginger bug. After about 3 days, it stopped smelling so nicely gingery and started smelling a little funky.
Like boozy funky or like sour funky? Or?
No, yeah, like sour, fermenty, sort of, what's the stuff they like here? The Vegemite or Marmite.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So I thought it was working pretty well. So after that, you want to get whatever sweet drink you're about to add this to. So if you're making sort of traditional ginger ale, you would just chop some ginger, boil it in, I don't know, a couple of cups of water.
So this is ginger ale, not ginger beer?
Ginger beer, yeah. I'm not really sure why they would be different things, but ginger beer. You chop some ginger, boil it, add some sugar to it, stir it up. So basically you made like a ginger flavored syrup. You sort of strain the ginger out of there. And then you add a good amount of cool water to that. And the reason for that is you need to cool down that mixture before you add your ginger bug to it.
Otherwise you'll kill it.
Yeah, so that's the step I'm concerned about. So it felt cool enough to me. I think about 120 degrees Fahrenheit is about all yeast can handle, and it felt cooler than that to me. So I went ahead and added my ginger bug, but maybe I was a little impatient. I'm not sure. Then you put it you just put it into bottles after that and let it ferment for a couple of days. In theory, there's like CO2 being produced, so you're supposed to go
carbonating it in the bottle.
Yeah, and producing alcohol at the same time. So you're supposed to sort of vent your bottles every couple of days.
Sure.
So the first time I sort of vented one of them, I could hear sort of the gas escape. And then the second time I did it, I didn't really hear anything. And so I was like, oh, that's not what I expected. And I also couldn't really see any bubbles happening in my bottles. But here I have the finished product.
So did you have it in like one of those Grolsch bottles?
I did, yeah. So it's a super thick. This is not right.
Does it smell good? Right. What is it? I mean, like
it smells good-ish. Yeah. What does this remind me of? Have you done the chia? Is it like chia seeds you throw in water and they make like that gelatinous?
Like the water kefir thing, or no? I don't mess with any of that stuff. Since we've been locked down, I've fermented a hot sauce from scratch using some habaneros, garlic, and carrots, and that's really good. And I had Abe bring me some xanthan gum, so I was able to stabilize it into like an actual, looks like something you could sell. And then I made some giardiniera, some fermented giardiniera.
Cool.
But I haven't messed with any other fermentation. Those have been my fermentation projects so far. I haven't messed with anything else.
What I have created here is very syrupy and not carbonated and probably not alcoholic. Yeah. I don't know what to compare that to exactly. But it's almost like if you try to do home canned jam, you sort of get, I don't know. I added a little lemon juice to this. I don't know if I've created some sort of pectin with the sugar and the brute. I don't know what's going on here, right? But it did not ferment adequately. So here's what I got to figure out now. So I kept feeding my ginger bug. And so what I might do is just once I get that sort of going again, just add it to these bottles and see what happens there. So I don't know if the ginger bug just wasn't as active as I thought it was, or I screwed up that step and my water was too hot when I added the bug to it.
Right, because as long as the sugar's still in there,
yeah,
you should be able to get it going again.
That's what I think.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
I'm having a beer in honor of you. On one of our last outings before everything got shut down, Abe and I and our wives and dog went on a hike out in Maryland. We went on a hike specifically because I saw a brewery I wanted to go to, and I was like, Abe, find us a hike near this brewery, and then we'll go hike, and then we'll go to a brewery. Mm-hmm. And Abe said yes. And then we did the hike. That
sounds awesome.
We did the hike, and then there ended up being a brewery even closer to where we finished the hike. It was like literally around the corner from the parking lot of where we did the hike. And this is the Elder Pine Brewing and Blending Company. And this is one of their limited offerings called a Proper Porter, a historic London-style porter.
A porter.
1/4 porter.
Right. Proper.
Ooh,
proper porter.
Nice. They did not screw up the fermentation on this one. They successfully fermented it into
Well, keep rubbing it in. Thanks.
I don't know exactly what makes a porter a historic London style versus a modern American style.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe I should have left it out at room temperature. I don't like. I don't know what
It was called porter because the porters drink it.
And who are they?
People who load things at docks and carry things
But why do
around.
they need a special kind of beer? Like, why couldn't they just drink?
Yeah, I have read something about this, but I can't remember why that style got associated with porter. If it was cheap or strong or something. I don't remember. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean,
Are you furiously Googling right now?
no, not furiously, but half-heartedly. I mean, you're right. It does say that, the name originated due to popularity with street and river porters. But I guess it's not crazy that things would have been like that I guess if you're only ever hanging out with porters and y'all decide you like drinking the same thing, then that becomes associated with you. But it just seems weird that like something like an IPA that makes sense. Like you're sending it's a pale ale that you're sending to India. Yeah. Like, but the idea that just like only coal miners drink this beer, so that's coal mine style. Like, I don't know.
Right. Oh, yeah, and it says that stouts were just like stout was an adjective for the porter.
It's a type of porter, yeah.
Yeah, it was like a strong porter.
I mean, for people who aren't super familiar with beer, porter it's a dark beer. It's a dark ale that's usually dark because of the type of malt that gets used. Usually not too hoppy. A lot of times they come out like, roasty flavor, chocolatey flavors.
Yeah, coffee notes.
Flavors. Yeah. And they're pretty big range in proof. Like you can get some barrel-aged stouts that are, basically wine. This one's reasonable. This is only 5.8%. So I think I could finish this and still go and port something around. So maybe that's what makes it the historic style. Because I feel like the weird trends I don't know what the microbrew scene is like over in Britain right now, but I feel like we went really hard on the high gravity stuff in the microbrewing scene here in the States, and then now we're kind of pulling back from that and realizing like maybe people want to have more than one beer.
That's good. Well, they tend to be lower gravity here, just because I mean the pints are 20 ounces here, right? They're not 16-ounce pints,
like
so you're drinking more, and I don't know why. So things tend to hover around like 3 and 4%. Like the microbrewing scene is I think become a bigger deal here in the last 10 or 20 years. So the gravities are creeping up, but sort of historically blended beers are a bit weaker. But there's also the culture of you just drink them all night long. So
not anymore, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, not anymore.
Are you able to get like takeout? Can you like call the pub and have a beer brought out or whatever? Or?
There is one pub in town that I'm aware of that is delivering basically growlers.
Yeah. Crowlers have become pretty handy in these times.
Yeah.
I don't have a brewery in walking distance here at my apartment, but I have 2 cideries that are both within walking distance.
Oh, yeah.
I think they're both doing takeout in Crowlers, and I've hit them up once or twice so far.
Very cool.
Well, I don't know how to transition back to my interview with Maya, except to say that...
maybe we'll discuss some experiments that didn't fail.
Oh, discuss some experiments that didn't fail. I was going to say, yep, yours is better. We're going to go with that. Part 2, interview, go.
Well, let's go back and listen to Maya. Maybe she can tell us about some experiments that didn't fail.
Okay, so I guess many people, maybe even my own perception of Antarctica is that, it's a continent covered in penguins, but it's really a continent covered in ice, and the penguins, I'm guessing, actually exist more at the fringes of the continent. And so can you tell us what a little bit about your research and what it is you're doing down there on the southern continent?
Yeah, of course. So my research is generally focused on the floating ice shelves of Antarctica. So these are just the bits of ice that are sitting on top of the ocean, and they actually, through contact with the sides, so the bedrock itself, or the rock that forms the continent itself, and then contact with highs in the seafloor, they can actually kind of hold back the ice that's sitting on top of the continent itself and not floating on the ocean. So that's the ice. That grounded ice is the ice that, if it were to melt, if it were to flow into the Southern Ocean, would contribute to sea level rise. So I'm really interested in the various processes by which these ice shelves, so those floating masses of ice, gain and lose mass. And so ice shelf stability and those processes of mass loss or mass gain are really important for future projections of how much sea level rise we can expect from the Antarctic continent.
So are your questions in terms of scale or in terms of timing? And if so, like, what is the scale and the timing? Like, how much ice are they gaining and losing, and over what period of seasonally, yearly, decadally?
Yeah, so I'm focused on two main processes. One is a small-scale calving process at the fronts of the major ice shelves in Antarctica, so the biggest ones, and the ones that actually have the highest potential to hold back grounded ice. And so these calving events, these iceberg glass shedding events, are triggered by elevated ocean melting, and we think that that is a seasonal process, that elevated melting that kind of coincides with warming of the ocean near the ice shelf front. But the feature that develops and that eventually leads to the calving event kind of forms over the course of several years. And then at some point, the ice shelf won't be able to take the sort of stresses that are induced by this melting, and then the calving event will occur. And then the other process that I'm focused on is the freezing of ice onto the base of these ice shelves, actually from the ocean water. And so I'm using...
So they're freezing from like the bottom up and then floating?
Yeah. So the ice shelves are... so they flow off the continent. And
so I guess are they floating on the water, or are they is more of it being held up by the continent and the shelf itself is just strong enough to like support its own weight?
Yeah, so they are floating on the water, but they're also in contact with the continent itself, like the topographic constraints. So a lot of them are embayed kind of in these little, I guess, caverns, you could say, that the Antarctic continent forms.
Oh,
and so,
okay.
Yeah, so they're in contact with that rock, and that produces kind of sidewall friction, and that friction actually kind of propagates upstream as like something called a backstress, and that backstress is what holds the grounded ice that's upstream in place.
Okay.
And so ice shelves one of the ways that ice shelves lose mass is through melting of their bases by warm ocean water. So if they're floating, there's an ocean cavity below, and warm water can intrude into that cavity and then flow up and eat away at the ice shelves' bases.
Right, because the warm water is going to float to the top of the water column on that part of the ocean. So you're always going to have the warmest water encroaching on the bottom of the ice, right?
Yeah, assuming that there isn't some salinity contribution that's making it more dense than other water. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so a lot of what we hear about in this field of ice-ocean interactions is basal melting of ice shelves by warm ocean water.
And so basal melting is just that melting from the bottom?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. And oceanographers and glaciologists have worked together kind of to identify the characteristics of the water masses that actually eat away at the ice shelf bases. But in the right circumstances, these water masses can actually lead to the freezing in place of seawater, and that those frozen bits of seawater can actually stick to the ice shelf base, and that forms a layer of ice called marine ice, and it's actually warmer than the ice that develops just from snowfall and flow of ice from the grounded portion of the continent.
Does the salt get incorporated into that ice as well? Because I imagine the snow is not going to have any salt.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it is. So this marine ice is much more saline, and it's also, because it's warmer, it's softer. And so that means that it can actually kind of deform more, and it can kind of take stresses and just kind of
absorb
it's like
them. Rubberier. It's like
yeah, exactly. And so that can actually change kind of if there's a big enough marine ice layer, then that can actually change the viscosity profile or the overall, I guess, strength and rubberiness of the ice column in a given ice shelf. And so it's an important structural element. And I'm looking at mapping the presence of this marine ice mass on Ross Ice Shelf, which is the biggest ice shelf by area in Antarctica.
So it's like if the ice shelf is like a steel sheet, like it's this rigid thing that could be deflected if you put enough force on it, but instead you're just welding a bunch of like very malleable copper to the bottom of it, and that's going to change the properties of how it responds to different stressors and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And a couple of other ice shelves have marine ice layers that are over 100 meters thick. And so and when we're talking about, so the Ross Ice Shelf, we think that the marine ice layer is maybe on the order of tens of meters thick, but the Amory Ice Shelf, I think in some places, the marine ice layer is almost 200 meters thick, and the ice shelf itself is like maybe 1,500 meters thick in that place. And so that's like a seriously, that might be wrong. That ratio might be wrong. I might need to look that up. But it's like a seriously big portion of the overall ice thickness. Yeah.
Okay, so that's great background and big picture. And I guess my next question would be, so what are your actual methods for measuring what it is you're measuring? And what exactly are you measuring?
Yes. So for the ice front process, the calving process, I'm using...
And these calves, when we say calving, it sounds like cute and twee, but like these are huge chunks of ice.
So
they're actually not for the Ross Shelf? Okay.
So these are pretty small pieces of ice.
I'm picturing, James Baylog chasing ice, like tidal waves being formed, sort of stuff.
Yeah, so there might be small waves being formed, and you might be able to pick up the energy release associated with that on with a seismometer, for example. But they're not the huge calving events that we think of and that we've seen on videos.
Okay, cool. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, no problem. They are still big in the scheme of things, but they're fairly skinny, and they kind of form along pre-existing weaknesses in the ice shelves. Yeah. And so I'm using altimetry data from both airborne and satellite campaigns to kind of map the surface feature that we know is associated with this sort of calving event. And so that altimetry data is basically just data that shows the height or elevation of a specific surface. And so we can actually see how the surface changes near the front, how it changes in height. And that gives us a clue that this process, this elevated ocean melting might be happening here.
So your assumption is if the altitude of the ice sheet, of the top of it goes down, then you're assuming you've seen melting, but if it goes up, you've seen new ice, marine ice forming?
Oh, sorry. So I think
you were talking about the calving. Right.
Yeah, but I don't think I actually explained the feature itself very well. So what we're looking for in the elevation data is this little uptick in the surface right by the ice shelf front. And so that uptick, it's called a rampart moat, or it's been called that by other people. With the uptick being the rampart, and then a little depression immediately inboard of that rampart called the moat.
You say rampart, like an old fort?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
This sounds very Game of Thronesy now. Like the rampart moat of the Ross Shelf has fallen.
Exactly. And it's a little weird. It's it should be flipped, in my opinion, because if we think of the thing that you want to keep out as the ocean, then the moat should be outside of the rampart. But I don't know. Maybe I'm getting my medieval architecture wrong.
Yeah, who would have thought that you would need to include a medieval literature and history Ph.D. candidate on your, as your collaborator on?
Oh, I know. I'm really regretting that my non-science person on my committee wasn't a medieval historian.
Who would have thought?
But so we're looking for that rampart moat feature, and that feature develops because of that elevated ocean melting that I was talking about.
Okay, that makes more sense.
And we can actually use repeated altimetry profiles to see when the calving event has occurred, or at least to kind of narrow or identify a window over which that calving period could
And how
have
are you
occurred.
measuring the altimetry? Like, you out there with a ruler, or like what's the...
So I'm using satellite data mostly from this mission called the Ice Cloud and Land Elevation Satellite. It was a satellite launched by NASA, and it was operational between 2003 and 2009. And NASA actually launched a follow-on mission in September of 2018. And my advisor is a science team member for that mission. And so I got to use the data almost as soon as it was available because of that, which was really fun and really cool. And I got to go to see the satellite launch.
So are you literally just like waiting for an email that is like this satellite emailing you what it's seeing, or how to like...
So no, I have all the data and I have to sort through it all myself. And I wish I were good enough at machine learning and automation that I could just write something that would look for it for me and it could just email me when it found it. But yeah, I think I need like little minions for that, unfortunately.
I've attended some meetings recently that are like kind of big picture. What's the future of geosciences moving forward, and specifically with thoughts on marine learning and AI. And like, there's talk about rewriting geology curriculum from jump to basically be a coding degree that your data set is usually earth science data.
Oh, wow. I mean, I don't think that's a bad idea. My undergrad degree was in earth sciences and I didn't do any coding at all. And I feel like it just wasn't in tune with how the sciences are going. So maybe that's not such a terrible idea.
Yeah, you either need a collaborator who can handle the big data stuff, or you got to learn it yourself. And if it's hard to pick up when you don't get it in undergrad. I mean, I was fortunate. I had kind of a math heavy geoscience education, but I didn't have any specific coding. But fortunately, a lot of my earth science stuff has to do with like ecology, and R has kind of become the de facto language of ecologists for analyzing data, and it's open source. And so I wasn't, I was able to, there's a lot of resources out there for figuring out how to use R. So I think I'm not a great coder, but I can get done what I need to get done in the, in the R environment, and then apply
and
that.
That's all we can ask for when it comes to computing, or at least that's how I feel.
I have a friend who was doing a postdoc at the Smithsonian, and she was such an R guru that she basically, like, if she saw you open Illustrator because you couldn't get R to make the figure that you wanted to make, she would come over and be like, no, we're going to figure out how to do this in code. Like, you are not allowed to open, if you have to open Illustrator, like, I'm going to kick you out of our group. Like, it was,
Oh my gosh. Wow. Good for her.
That was great.
Impressive.
I learned so much from just, because it was the sort of thing, it was like, but I already know how to do it in Illustrator. She's like, exactly. So you have nothing to learn there. Like, figure it out in R.
You can't argue there.
No, I couldn't. I made some really good figures during that time.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Well, that's awesome. So I guess big picture results, what are you seeing in the data that you're getting from these altimetry measurements that you're taking on the Ross ice sheet?
Yeah.
Sheet or shelf? Ice shelf?
Shelf. Mm-hmm. So just we're seeing this feature, this signature of elevated ocean melting across the ice shelf front, which is really cool. Not only does it kind of validate this existing model that somebody else had developed, or my co-author had actually developed, to kind of explain how icebergs with similar features could decay. But it's really cool to kind of see the feature in real life and see calving events arise from it. And so the big picture implication for this is, so Ross Ice Shelf, it's the biggest ice shelf, and it has one of the highest buttressing or restraint potentials for grounded ice. And so it's really important in terms of ice sheet stability.
We need it.
Yeah, we need it. Exactly. And so if this, right now, it's in steady, or it's relatively in balance. And so it's not losing more mass than it's gaining. But if something were to change, like, for example, if the ocean, the top part of the ocean near the front got a lot warmer just due to climate change, if that were to happen, then we could see this process play a bigger role. And in theory, this calving process could lead to a massive retreat in the right conditions. I'm not saying that's happening now, but in a warmer ocean, that could actually cause the ice front to step back, and that would reduce the overall buttressing potential of the ice shelf, and that would lead to the acceleration of the glaciers and the ice streams that are feeding the ice shelf into the Southern Ocean, and that would directly contribute to sea level rise.
And when you say like warming oceans, obviously the entire ocean is absorbing a ton of carbon dioxide and atmospheric heat. I think if we lived on a planet with smaller oceans, no one would be able to ignore climate change the way that we try to ignore it now, just because the ocean is like such a huge repository of energy and carbon dioxide that is really buffering us against some of our own worst habits. But I think that's one trend. But the ocean is a huge body of water, so it's going to warm relatively slowly. But I imagine that there's a model for your for the ice shelf, the Ross ice shelf, where even if the ocean doesn't warm up significantly, if the currents change and the way that warm water is moved around the ocean could really throw a lot of heat under the Ross ice shelf where we don't want it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of a feedback. So there's still a lot of feedbacks in the climate system that we don't know about or that we don't understand fully. But if you have just a little bit of warm water that can enter the cavity below an ice shelf or access the front of an ice shelf and melt it, then that creates that adds mass and adds pretty cold fresh water into the surrounding ocean, and that will affect the circulation, the regional circulation of the Southern Ocean, and then it will also affect deep water formation that kind of occurs as a result of the existing circulation, density-driven circulation mostly. And so if we add mass and if we add fresh water to this ocean, then that's actually going to affect the entire global current system. And that in turn could in theory lead to changing conditions near the Ross Ice Shelf. And so it could kick into place a pretty critical feedback that we don't really know very much about, and that we're still trying to figure out. Yeah.
That's the thing I was going to say is the more knock-on effects you add to the system, the harder it is to predict what it's actually going to do. Because if you think of like the feedbacks and the knock-on effects, like the pegs in a game of Plinko, like you can't. It's really you can maybe guess if it's going to go if the Plinko chip's going to go left or right once or twice, but at a certain point after a dozen Plinko hits, you don't really know where it's going to go. Like it's too difficult to string all the predictions together in a way that has any predictive power.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important that we act on climate change now. We don't know everything, but we know enough to know that we're literally tampering with our climate system. And there's so much more that we don't know. And that's what's really scary. And we don't have time to figure it all out. We don't have time to figure out all of the science. We already have enough.
Yeah, once the effects start, it's already too late.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's funny that this kind of ties back into what we were talking about before. Just like we were saying, all politics is local. It sounds like all ice melt is local, but it also has worldwide effects as bigger.
Yeah, definitely. I'm from Miami originally, and I grew up on a barrier island just east of the downtown area, and it's pretty clear that what I'm studying and what other people in my group are studying is going to lead to the inundation of my hometown, which is kind of crazy. And that's a huge motivator for me, not just studying the science for the sake of learning more and getting to go to the coolest place in the world, but
Florida?
They're just, no. I wish. I love Florida, but I don't think I can say that.
I'm technically from Florida as well. I was born in Florida. Yeah, I'm a Panhandle guy though. So
cool, nice. Well,
I'm up on the Emerald Coast, as we like to call it, or the Redneck Riviera, as we also like to call it. Yeah, I'm from the part of my joke is that I'm from the part of Florida that's actually Alabama.
Yeah.
I'm not from the retirees and Cubano sandwiches part of Florida. So
right, exactly. Well, that's where I'm from. So
my sister lives in South Florida now, and she's got a great bagel shop right nearby. And I'm like, gee, how did this pop up? Like,
that's cool.
Yeah, it was cool. I had a great time.
Yeah, but so it's kind of, I think it's important to have that motivator for me, especially because I love the science, but I don't really plan on continuing to do it. Like, I think the motivator of climate change and the necessity for climate action is kind of too great for me to just like stay in academia, stay in the ivory tower and continue to, unless I were like Katharine Hayhoe, who was actually at Scripps last week and is like the most incredible scientist / science communicator there is. Like, I don't know. I don't feel like this is, I don't know. I just think that more scientists need to step out of their comfort zones.
We could use more Katharine Hayhoes. If you would like to become another Katharine Hayhoe, I would support that because she's a really impressive person. We haven't had her on the show yet, but she's on my list. So,
oh my gosh, she would be so great. Like literally the last week I was just so inspired by her. I was just walking around and
Well, I would imagine people are going to be inspired by everything you've talked about now as well. You know,
you're very kind.
Okay, so just a few more questions to kind of wrap everything up.
Okay.
Just two questions that are sort of related. If people were to remember one big picture takeaway message from your research, what would you want that to be? And then same question, but about your advocacy.
Okay. So the big takeaway about my research that I'd like to highlight is actually what you brought up, that gravitational effect and this idea that different masses of ice will affect different coastlines and different communities in different ways. So Greenland will actually end up having a disproportionate sea level rise effect on the southern hemisphere, and Antarctica, which is the sleeping giant of sea level rise. It has it has 6 times the sea level potential as Greenland, 6+ times. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be the kind of critical piece of the sea level rise puzzle for northern hemisphere coastlines, like places like we grew up.
Yeah. And then in terms of advocacy, what do you want people to take away from the work you've been doing?
Yeah, I guess, well, I feel like something that I've really learned, and this is going to tie into something that Katharine Hayhoe said, so I hope she doesn't come on your show and say the exact same thing.
I think that would be, hey, sometimes, a choir is louder than a soloist. Like it helps to have multiple voices saying the same thing to make it louder for those in the back, right?
Very right. So she talked about this kind of spectrum of outreach and kind of finding that point on the spectrum where you're comfortable, where you're not pushing yourself too much and putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. And I think I didn't think very much of the op-ed format before I wrote this one, but I think that's a really great kind of stepping stone. And I was very comfortable with that format. And so I think it's really important to find where you're comfortable. I'm also finding that I'm comfortable speaking with policymakers to a certain degree, which is kind of crazy. I wouldn't have thought that a few years ago. But I think finding where you are on the outreach spectrum and then what you're willing to do. And Katharine Hayhoe put this in a really nice way. For some people that could just be that could be just continuing to publish your research, which is relevant to climate change or not. But for other people, that could mean running for office. And so I think her point about finding your niche in that is really important, and just continuing to work at that level is really great.
I also think there's value in occasionally putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. For me, that's for me. I've been doing science outreach in this podcast format for 10 years now. It's something I'm very comfortable with. So comfort can sometimes lead to complacency. So I've been doing things in the last year or so that, like you said, talking to policymakers, things like that are less comfortable for me. And I think that there's value there too.
Are they becoming more comfortable for you?
Well, I think it's building on what you said, where it's like find the thing that you're comfortable doing and develop that as a skill, and then learn the ways in which the development of that skill can help you in places where you might feel less comfortable.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
So for me, I feel like I've gotten pretty comfortable at speaking on a mic when I'm alone in a room and nobody's here. So how do I, but like that ability to string a thought together and hope, it's all in the goal of giving myself less to edit. How do I just say the thing right in the first place? Yeah. That can serve me well in a meeting with policymakers where I can't go back and edit it. I have to say it right in the first place, and I have to make my point quickly and clearly. And so like, if I think of it in those terms, the skills I honed by doing something that was comfortable for me also helped at the times where I was in situations that were less comfortable, but still important and worth pursuing.
Right. That's a great point.
All right. Well, I think we did it. I think solved science. One last thing is, what do you have coming down the pike, and where can people find out more about your work in the wide world of the internet if they're curious to learn more?
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'm going to graduate.
That's always the hope.
Yeah. I'm hoping to graduate this calendar year, which is scary to say out loud. And that involves publishing some papers that I've been procrastinating on. But after that, I'd really actually like to do something like what you're doing, Ryan. I am applying for I don't want to say this out loud in case I don't get it, but whatever. A NOAA Marine Policy Fellowship.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I am hoping to live in DC at least for a year or two, test that out. But I'd really like to just kind of transition into some sort of climate or sea level rise advisory role. I'm not really sure at what level. I want to start at the federal level just because that's what interests me most, but I could very well end up advising my hometown or something like that in their sea level rise adaptation. But yeah, in terms of my online presence, I'm a little slow on the social media uptake. I don't have my own Twitter or my own website, but you can follow my group on Twitter, and I sometimes contribute to this account at SIO Glaciology. And we post a lot about what we're doing at meetings. And then we also have a few threads on what we did at COP, that International Climate Conference that I was talking about earlier. Yeah, and there's some cool pictures of me with Nancy Pelosi and a large group of people, but we're both in there.
Yeah, no, that's some serious squad goal vibes.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you make it to DC, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will take you to some of my favorite coffee shops around the district.
Excited, and I want to go to the beer farm.
Yes, we can definitely go to the beer farm. That's a little bit further outside the district. It's so funny when you're living here. Like, I'm not a city kid by birth and development, but I've had to kind of grow into a city animal with where I currently live. But like, you drive 25 miles outside DC and there are hay bales. Like it takes longer than it should to drive those 25 miles. But once you're out there, you're back in the boonies pretty quick. So once you make it to DC, we will get coffee, and then we will take that coffee and fuel our drive out to the beer farm, and we'll have a great time.
Oh, so pumped. So ready.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I had a lot of fun talking to you. I think people will get a lot out of our conversation, and have a great evening.
So thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Plink plonk. So that was my interview with Maya. Thank you so much to Lauren Wood for coordinating that interview. She has helped me and hooked me up with various folks from Scripps over the years, and has a really good sense for when we're going to have a good conversation with somebody. So I definitely appreciate her being on the lookout for us in that way. Yeah, not a lot of places to follow Maya on the internet, as you heard. So if you have feedback for her about this episode, you can send that feedback straight to us, and we will forward it along to her. And if it's really something special, you might hear about it on our final segment, the PaleoPOW. Final segment of the show where we tackle the feedback that comes in from all corners of the internet. And Patrick, you want the review, or you want the handle thesis duty? What are you feeling?
I'll take the review. I'll help as much as I can on thesis duty, but you kick that off.
Well, no, let's do the review first because there might be, you never know when there's going to be stuff in we've started kind of switching it up a little bit where you never know what's going to come in the PaleoPOW segment itself that might also be useful in figuring out the thesis. So we're actually kind of reserving theses to the end now.
Okay.
Nothing like ending strong with a poorly defined improv game between people who aren't trained in improv.
Yes, and.
It's a good start.
Okay, I got an iTunes review from JackDo24.
It sounds like another person that you'd be giving portions to. Oh yeah, JackDo over on Jakku.
All right, JackDo24. All right, JackDo. I'm assuming I'm going to go with male pronouns.
We've never known. We've always This has been a struggle the entire length of the podcast.
It says this podcast is super inspiring! ! 5 stars. All right. Great review already. I'm going to go further, though. Science Sort of is honestly one of my favorite podcasts. I've only been listening for the past 6 months or so. Our episodes aren't that long. But in that time, it's become one of my top faves. The subject matter and discussions are really well thought through and put together. As an environmental bio major, this podcast makes me want to go out and continue to learn more about the world and all the interesting things it has to offer. Thanks for the inspiration. Well, you're welcome, JackDo24. Thanks for the review.
Yeah, and thanks for studying environmental biology. That's an important field.
Yeah, it's gonna be crucial.
Yeah, I think we're gonna need to know what's going on. So get out there and figure it out, and then come on the show and tell us about it.
Please do. All right. And when you finish, I'm assuming you're gonna have a thesis.
Right. So we're, the podcast is supported by Patreon, and you can support us by going to patreon.com/science sort of. And if you do so at the Avogadro's Army level or higher, we will give you as a reward live on the show a made up thesis. And this episode's thesis goes to Lindsay M, who says in her Patreon profile, "I believe in being childlike without being childish. I love nature and wildlife." Sounds like somebody who would be into environmental biology.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't plan that. But this is exactly why we do it that way, Pat.
So do you think they're the same person?
You think JackDo is an alias? It's possible.
All right. Let's see. So now usually these have the thesis titles coincidentally have to do with things we talked about on the episode in which the thesis is being bestowed, right?
Yes. So it's all weaving it together with the things we talk about on the show, whatever we know about the person.
Right.
So maybe something about like the environmental biology of something in Antarctica, but like has to do with children, like being childlike without being childish.
Right.
Like maybe like the paedomorphosis of like a penguin.
Paedomorphosis of extremophilic yeast culturing penguins from the cryosphere.
Paedomorphosis of penguins.
Yeast culturing penguins.
Do they have to be yeast culturing? I feel like a yeast culture on a penguin would be some sort of ectoparasite.
That's all I know about this show. Let's see.
Let's see. Paedomorphosis of penguins, : So wait, should we explain what paedomorphosis is? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, we can. Paedomorphosis is when an animal or species reaches reproductive maturity before it expresses adult characteristics. So like it would be like if in frogs, if tadpoles reached reproductive maturity and started reproducing before ever going to the frog stage, and then you would have this new species of tadpole things and all of a sudden there would be sort of adult tadpoles, which is not really possible currently, right? A tadpole is by definition a juvenile frog. Is that helpful, Ryan?
Yes.
Maybe you can add to it.
All right, how's this? Paedomorphosis of penguins, exploring the environmental biology of childlike chicks on Antarctica's Ross Sea.
I like it.
I couldn't work in fermentation, but I think that still ties in a few things for Lindsay. That actually sounds like a good study. Like every once in a while we come up with something.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're ridiculous, but like this, if there was a species of penguins that was evolving to be a more childlike version of themselves into adulthood, like I'd want to know. I'd want to know about that.
Paedomorphosis of penguins.
I don't know.
Nice, yeah. I mean, that would.
Not, but
That is a science paper.
Yeah.
Nature paper.
Good job, Lindsay. You might be the most well
the most cited study of
there you go. Oh, that'd be so funny if we started at the next level of Patreon, we start giving out impact factors to our patrons. Actually, I realized very quickly in my head that would just amount to us ranking the people who support the show, and that feels wrong. I don't think so. Maybe we won't do that, but that's a great thesis. I actually think there's a there.
Yeah, I'm blown away by our listeners and how good the science they do is,
especially when it seems like it could have just been made up on the spot. Well, Patrick, you got anything else going on in your life, or are things, you're watching things ferment poorly and hanging out?
You're right, or not? Yeah, no, I don't have any internet projects free to follow. I don't think. Just a
Twitter feed if you want to see a man angry about roads.
Yeah, that's right. Or I think I just taken what is it? Is it the red pill? Yeah, taking the red pill. I've seen what life can be like if you in a town you can walk around it.
All right. Real talk. You don't want to refer to yourself as a red pill dude on the internet. That's like the men's rights people. And like the guys who
I am aware that they call themselves that, but I didn't realize they had co-opted the term so fully that you weren't allowed to make a Matrix reference anymore.
I mean, it is ironic that they have co-opted a reference in what in hindsight seems to be a very clear allegory for like coming out as trans, but world's weird, I guess. I don't know what to tell you.
It's weird.
Yeah. So
all right, so we can back up. So yeah,
it's all good. I think people realize you're not a men's rights activist, Patrick. I don't.
Well, unless you live in a country where you have no civil rights anyway, and then I guess I'm for men's rights as much as anyone else is. But carry on, do what you do, internet. I just keep taking over things that we try to use to make allegories and allusions to, and turn them into horrible things. Thank you.
Good job, internet. Well, this show's on the internet. You can find it at sciencesortof.com, where there will be show notes for this episode and links to everything that we talked about, and including social media and Patreon support and PayPal donations and all that good stuff. So if that is of interest to you, go check that out. And if you enjoyed this program, be sure to come back next time. We've already recorded it, so I know what we're talking about. Should I give him a little sneak peek?
We're not really in the business of giving teasers, but we could try it. See if it whets any appetites.
Hippos, but not where you think. All right, come back for that, because when that episode comes out, it's gonna be full of a whole lot of science.
Sort of. Should we try that again?
Why?
Oh.
I think we were in like perfect unison.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It didn't sound that way from here. Okay, cool.
I just intuited that you were going to give me a kind of lackluster melancholic sort of, and I just went with it, and I was exactly right.
Cool.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
About the Narnia stories, and there's a certain type of kids story where this happens, where like within the context of the story the kids grow up, but then it's undone by the end of the story and they go back to being kids, and I'm like, that would mess me up so much.
Right.
It's like, because the kid's in Narnia, like he's a king with like a sword and a wife, and then it's like no, you're a teenager again. Like it's in the first Jumanji does that too.
Yeah. In
a way that I'm just like, wouldn't that really scar you and make living your rest of your life linearly very difficult? Am I crazy for thinking about this so much, or what? What's going on here?
Well, probably.